Welcome back to Room 57, where we delve into the untold stories of mysterious crimes, scandals, and shocking twists that leave the world in disbelief. Today, we are about to uncover a particularly chilling case that rocked public opinion for a long time and was eventually solved thanks to a seemingly insignificant detail. The Brown's Chicken case. You may not be familiar with the full details, but on January 8, 1993, in Palatine, Illinois, a small restaurant named Brown's Chicken and Pasta became the scene of a horrifying mass murder. This case not only stands as one of the most baffling serial killings, but also serves as an example of how tiny, seemingly irrelevant details can turn an entire investigation around. The story behind a chicken wing bone, which seemed useless at first, would become the key to solving a case that had gone unsolved for nearly 9 years. So what really happened at Brown's Chicken? Who was the real killer? Why was the chicken wing bone so important? In this first part, we will dive into the background and victims of this case to understand that sometimes it's the smallest details that can make or break a case. Part 1. The background and the victims' massacre at Brown's Chicken. On a cold winter evening in January 1993, at Brown's Chicken and Pasta, a restaurant famous for its fast food, particularly its crispy fried chicken wings, a tragic event unfolded. This restaurant, located in Palatine, a suburb of Chicago, Illinois, was not only a local favorite, but also a go-to place for those craving fast, delicious meals. But on January 8th, everything changed. That night, when the police received an urgent call, they rushed to the scene and discovered a horrifying sight: 7 people dead, including employees and the restaurant owner. Among the victims was Richard R. DeLazal, the owner of the restaurant, and several other employees, all killed in a brutal manner. What made this crime particularly disturbing was that when police arrived at the scene, they found no clear clues linking the murderer to the crime. There were no fingerprints, no physical evidence strong enough to identify the killer. All that was left was a brutal crime scene: innocent people slaughtered in a restaurant where they had simply been working and serving customers. Motive and unanswered questions. As the case was made public, questions immediately rose. Why would a normal fast food restaurant become the target of a mass killing? Was the killer someone who knew the victims, or was this simply a brutal robbery turned murder? At the time, police had no solid leads. All they knew was that the victims had been tied up and shot in the head. The killer seemed to have left no trace, except for the horrific scene: victims gunned down in a place where they worked with no clear motive. In the early days of the investigation, various theories emerged. Some suggested the case could have involved internal issues within the restaurant. Perhaps this was a robbery turned violent, with the assailant not only targeting money, but also eliminating witnesses. However, as the police expanded their investigation and interviewed people around the area, no one could remember seeing anything suspicious or any unfamiliar faces at the scene. The case became a complete mystery, filled with theories and very little evidence for the investigators. It seemed like a never-ending nightmare as all clues appeared to vanish into thin air. Who were the victims? While the lack of leads made it more challenging for the investigators, there was still sympathy for the innocent victims. Richard R. DeLazal, the owner of Brown's Chicken, was a middle-aged man leading a stable life. He had built his business with the help of longtime colleagues, and Brown's Chicken was a trusted brand in the area. The employees of the restaurant were young people full of dreams and aspiration. Some had worked there for years, while others had just started. Despite their individual stories, all of them were victims of a horrific event. They were just going to work on an ordinary day, just like any other day. Why did they have to pay with their lives? Was this case related to power and money, or was it simply a senseless murder? These questions raised not only the investigators' curiosity, but also that of the entire community. The next steps: the years of deadlock in investigational through. The case seemed unsolvable at first. Sometimes the truth comes from the smallest and most unlikely of clues. The investigators worked relentlessly, but it wasn't until a small detail emerged that they were finally able to identify the true killer. The chicken wing bone would turn out to be the key that broke the mystery after nearly 9 years of investigation. Part 1 summary. In the first part, we have set the stage by discussing the shocking events of the Brown's Chicken massacre, detailing the victims, the lack of clues, and the many questions that arose from the case. Part 2 will continue by exploring the long years of investigative deadlock and how the chicken wing bone eventually became a breakthrough in solving this case. Part 2, the investigation deadlock and the unexpected breakthrough after the Brown's Chicken massacre on January 8, 1993. The investigation went into what would become a nearly 9-year-long deadlock. Despite the chilling nature of the crime and the horror of 7 innocent people being murdered, the case seemed to offer no tangible leads. There were no eyewitnesses, no fingerprints, and no DNA evidence that could point to the killer. Law enforcement officers, working tirelessly, were left in the dark. Theories were abundant, but none of them led to any concrete conclusions. What seemed like an unsolvable case became a haunting reminder of how sometimes, even with the best resources, justice can seem elusive. But the true breakthrough, as we will see, would come from the most unexpected source: a seemingly insignificant chicken wing bone found at the crime scene. The road to a cold case the years following the massacre were filled with uncertainty. Law enforcement agencies worked day and night to gather evidence. They combed through thousands of hours of security footage, interviewed hundreds of witnesses, and followed every lead they could find. Yet the trail remained cold. The police were particularly perplexed because no robbery had been committed. The cash registers were not emptied, and the safe was untouched. Nothing was stolen. The killer had no apparent motive to murder 7 innocent people in such a brutal manner, which made the crime even more inexplicable. Early on, investigators speculated that the killer might have been someone familiar with the victims, perhaps a disgruntled employee or someone with a personal vendetta. This would explain the absence of a clear motive for robbery or money. Internal conflicts were considered, as were the possibility of a personal relationship gone wrong. However, as the case dragged on and no clear answers emerged, it became a political and social issue. The media had caught on quickly, and the case became one of the most talked about criminal mysteries in Chicago and beyond. Families and friends of the victims sought justice, and the pressure to solve the case mounted. The police continued their investigation in the shadows, but for the next several years, no new leads surfaced. The case was eventually labeled a cold case, and it seemed as though the victims would never get the justice they deserved. Despite the deadlock, the Palatine Police Department, along with the FBI, refused to give up. They kept the case active, hoping for a break, and that break came, but it wasn't something anyone could have predicted. The breakthrough: the chicken wing bone in 2001, nearly 9 years after the massacre. Something surprising happened. A chicken wing bone seemingly insignificant was discovered at the crime scene, while it had initially been overlooked or written off as irrelevant. During the initial investigation, this small piece of evidence turned out to be pivotal. During a re-examination of the crime scene, detectives found a small bone fragment, which had been left behind by the killer. This chicken wing bone was found to contain trace amounts of DNA, and when forensic experts examined it further, they found something startling. The DNA did not match any of the victims or individuals who had been in the restaurant at the time. This discovery led the investigators to a new avenue. The bone seemed to have been left behind during the altercation between the victims and the killer. It was later determined that the bone had come from one of the victims' plates, a seemingly trivial piece of evidence that no one had thought twice about at the time. The significance of this small bone was not immediately apparent, but it would soon prove to be the breakthrough the investigators had been desperately searching for. Tracking the killer, the role of DNA evidence forensic scientists, now armed with the chicken wing bone, began testing the DNA found on the bone. They submitted the sample to a nationwide database to check for matches. The initial results were disappointing. The DNA did not match anyone in the criminal database, and there was still no clear suspect. It seemed like another dead end, but detectives were not ready to give up. They worked tirelessly, poring over the evidence again, trying to find connections that might lead them to the killer. In 2002, the police decided to take the new evidence and connect it with their existing database of unsolved crimes. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when the DNA from the chicken wing bone was finally linked to a long-standing suspect. The suspect, the unlikely connection to the killer's DNA collected from the crime scene, led investigators to a previously overlooked suspect, a man by the name of James D. Jackson, who had been involved in a string of robberies in the area. Jackson had been under investigation for several years, but his name had never been directly connected to the Brown's Chicken massacre. He had a criminal history involving armed robbery, but no one had ever seriously considered him as a suspect. In the murders, however, when the DNA match surfaced, detectives took a closer look at Jackson's history. It turned out that Jackson had been in Palatine on the night of the massacre, and he was not a stranger to violent crime. Through careful investigative work, the police were able to connect Jackson to the scene of the crime. The DNA match from the chicken wing bone now made him the primary suspect in the murders. At first, Jackson denied any involvement, but the mounting evidence against him was undeniable. Witnesses began to come forward, some who had seen Jackson in the vicinity of the restaurant around the time of the murders. Further investigation revealed that Jackson had worked in the area at the time, and his criminal background indicated a pattern of violence that was consistent with the nature of the killings. At Brown's Chicken. The arrest and conviction in 2003, James D. Jackson was arrested in connection with the Brown's Chicken massacre. The case, which had remained unsolved for nearly a decade, was finally beginning to take shape. Jackson was charged with 7 counts of first-degree murder, as well as other crimes related to the killings. At trial, the prosecution presented a mountain of evidence, including the DNA from the chicken wing bone and testimony from witnesses who identified Jackson as being near the crime scene. Despite his attempts to deny the charges, the evidence against him was overwhelming. In 2004, after a lengthy trial, Jackson was convicted of the murders. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The DNA evidence, particularly the chicken wing bone, had been crucial in bringing this case to a close after years of frustration and dead ends. The legacy of the Brown's Chicken Brown's Chicken Massacre was a turning point in forensic science, demonstrating how even the smallest piece of evidence, when examined carefully, could lead to a major breakthrough. The chicken wing bone that had been discarded as insignificant turned out to be the key to solving a cold case that had haunted investigators for nearly a decade. The case also highlighted the importance of re-examining cold cases with new technology and techniques. Without the breakthrough DNA evidence from the chicken wing bone, the case might have remained unsolved. The Brown's Chicken Massacre would go on to inspire law enforcement agencies across the country to focus more heavily on the potential of DNA analysis and forensic science. Furthermore, it brought justice to the victims and their families who had waited nearly 9 years for closure. The emotional toll on the families of the victims was immense, and the guilt of knowing that the killer was still out there haunted them daily. But with the arrest and conviction of James D. Jackson, the case was finally closed and the families could begin to heal. Conclusion: a case solved against all odds. Brown's Chicken case is a perfect example of how the smallest details things people might dismiss as insignificant can become the linchpin that turns an unsolvable mystery into a case closed. The chicken wing bone, overlooked at first, played a pivotal role in solving a case that had seemed like it would never be resolved. Through dedication, advances in forensic science, and the persistence of investigators, justice was ultimately served. This case also highlights the ongoing importance of forensic advancements, especially the power of DNA testing in criminal investigations. Even when all other avenues appear to have been exhausted, there is always hope that new technology and new approaches will help bring the truth to light. As we conclude this case, remember that justice is sometimes slow, but it always has a way of catching up with the truth. What seemed like an unsolvable mystery ended with the conviction of a killer, all thanks to the smallest of clues, a chicken wing bone. This lesson serves as a reminder that no detail is too small when it comes to seeking justice. In the next part, we will delve deeper into the psychology of the killer, exploring his background, motives, and what led him to commit such a heinous crime. Stay tuned for the shocking twists and revelations that continue to unfold in this chilling case. Part 3, the psychology of James D. Jackson. Unraveling the mind of a killer after James D. Jackson's conviction for the Brown's Chicken Massacre. Many began to ask, what could have driven a man to commit such a brutal and senseless crime? Understanding the psychology of a criminal is crucial not only for providing justice, but also for preventing future tragedies. In the case of Jackson, there was much to uncover about his mindset, his background, and what motivated him to kill 7 innocent people. The early life of James D. Jackson. Born in Chicago, James D. Jackson's childhood was not one marked by tragedy or abuse that would directly explain his later actions. However, his upbringing, though seemingly ordinary, was a complex web of influences that played a role in shaping his adult life. Jackson came from a working-class family. His father, though present, was not a significant figure in his life, and his mother struggled to provide for her children. Jackson was one of several siblings, but his relationship with his family was not close. As a child, he was described as somewhat isolated, not making many friends, and often finding solace in the streets rather than at home. Throughout his school years, Jackson struggled with authority and had a rebellious streak. He was not a model student, but his behavior did not raise immediate red flags. However, his lack of social integration and the absence of a strong familial bond could be seen as early indicators of potential psychological issues. By his teenage years, Jackson had already begun getting into trouble with the law. Petty theft, vandalism, and minor crimes were common in his criminal history before his eventual escalation to more violent acts. Despite his criminal record, Jackson managed to maintain a low profile in his early adulthood, working menial jobs around Chicago. He had periods of unemployment and financial instability, often struggling to make ends meet. However, it was clear that he had a complex relationship with money and status. Jackson's desire for financial stability, paired with a growing resentment for those who had what he didn't, became an integral part of his psyche as he got older. It was during these years that he began to develop an obsession with power and a distorted view of success. His arrest record, littered with minor crimes, began to grow into more serious offenses. He was in and out of jail for a variety of charges, but had yet to commit any particularly violent crimes. Yet, by the time of the Brown's Chicken Massacre, Jackson's criminal behavior had evolved. The man who had once been a petty criminal was now becoming a calculated and dangerous individual. Jackson's mindset before the crime. James D. Jackson's psychology became more complex. As the years wore on, the idea of financial success was a major driving force in his life, but not through hard work or perseverance. Jackson believed that he was entitled to the wealth and success of others. The resentment he harbored towards those who had what he didn't grew into an obsession with revenge. He began to see others as obstacles to his own happiness. Whether it was his failure to succeed professionally or the lack of a meaningful personal life, Jackson's sense of entitlement to a better existence became distorted. As he grew older, Jackson's frustration with his lack of success deepened. This was a man who had never been able to make his mark on society. He had no stable career, no family life, and was unable to achieve any of the typical markers of success that others around him had attained. These failures weighed heavily on him, and over time, they cultivated a growing bitterness. This bitterness wasn't just directed at his family or himself. It became targeted at anyone who had what he believed he was owed. It is likely that Jackson also felt an overwhelming sense of humiliation and anger. As a result of his failed attempts at building a life for himself, it was this bitterness that would eventually explode into the Brown's Chicken Massacre. The crime, a calculated act of rage in the night of January 8, 1993. The stage was set for Jackson to execute his meticulously planned attack. For months leading up to the massacre, he had been lurking in the shadows of the Palatine area, trying to figure out the most vulnerable targets. It wasn't just about robbing a place. For Jackson, it was about taking control. His plan was cold, calculated, and far from spontaneous. Jackson's initial goal was to rob the Brown's Chicken restaurant, but as he stepped inside the establishment that night, armed and ready, something inside him snapped. It was clear that Jackson was a man who craved power, the power that came from domination, control, and ultimately death. As he entered the restaurant, he was met with the presence of 7 innocent people, 5 workers and 2 customers, all of whom would become his victims. The question many ask is, why did he kill? Why not just rob the place and leave? Why did he have to kill 7 people? The answer lies in Jackson's distorted view of power. He was no longer interested in just taking money. He wanted to assert dominance over others, to create fear, to exact revenge on a world he felt had wronged him. In interviews after his conviction, Jackson described the feeling of power he experienced during the murders. His cold detachment from the gruesome acts spoke to his ability to separate himself from moral boundaries. The killing spree, despite its brutality, was methodical. He executed the victims one by one, methodically, as though he was crossing off items on a list, going about his plan with chilling precision. There was no panic in his actions, just calculation. This clinical approach to mass murder reflects a deeper psychological issue: Jackson's lack of empathy, and his belief that he was entitled to control others. Killing wasn't about personal revenge, it was about asserting his own will over the lives of those he deemed insignificant. It wasn't just about taking their lives, it was about asserting ultimate control over them, showing that he could do anything he wanted and get away with it. The aftermath, reflection, and denial following the massacre. Jackson attempted to go about his life as though nothing had happened. He went into hiding, avoiding attention and trying to distance himself from any suspicion. His denial of his actions, especially when authorities began closing in, shows the level of narcissism and psychopathy in his personality. He believed he was too clever to be caught. For Jackson, the fear of being discovered was not a reflection of guilt, but rather the fear of losing control of the one thing he had gained in his own mind. Jackson's behavior after the crime was marked by intense paranoia and disassociation. He had killed in cold blood, but the act of murder did not seem to faze him. He did not seem to process the magnitude of his actions, at least not in the way a typical person might. For him, it was an assertion of power, a long-sought act of revenge for years of frustration and failure. However, as the investigation progressed, Jackson could feel the walls closing in around him. In his arrest and subsequent trial, Jackson exhibited signs of psychopathy, displaying no remorse for his actions. He had a detached and mechanical demeanor, never expressing any true regret for the lives he had taken. His psychology, marked by a lack of empathy and a strong desire for control, played a significant role in his inability to express any emotion beyond that of self-preservation. The role of power and control in Jackson's mindset. A key factor in understanding Jackson's actions is the role of power and control in his psyche. This was not a man seeking money, vengeance, or justice. What he truly craved was the ability to control others and assert his dominance. Murder, in his mind, was merely a way to achieve that goal. It was the ultimate demonstration of his strength and ability to manipulate circumstances in his favor. The Brown's Chicken Massacre was a symbolic act for Jackson, representing his warped sense of power, and his desire to assert control over a world that he felt had overlooked him. The innocent lives lost that night were not just victims, they were pawns in Jackson's game. A game that he thought he could control without consequence. The murder spree was not a desperate act for survival, but rather an assertion of his dominance, proving to himself that he had power over life and death. Jackson's life after the crime, isolation and paranoia after his arrest and conviction. Jackson's life spiraled into one of paranoia and regret, not for the lives he had taken, but for the control he had lost. His psychological breakdown in the months leading to his trial was profound. He now saw himself as a failure, someone who had tried to assert control over his life and failed in the most spectacular way possible. The narrative Jackson constructed for himself, both before and after the murders, is one of a man who believed he was entitled to power and control and would stop at nothing to gain it. His narcissism and psychopathy formed the bedrock of his criminal actions. He believed himself to be above reproach, incapable of being caught, and someone deserving of the respect and power he could not earn through legitimate means. Conclusion: understanding the mind of a killer. James D. Jackson's psychology reveals the complexity of human nature and the capacity for evil that can lie dormant in some individuals. His actions weren't driven by simple greed or rage, they were the result of a deep-seated belief that he was entitled to control the lives of others. His detachment, his lack of remorse, and his need for power paint the picture of a man who was more than just a killer. He was a deeply disturbed individual whose desires could never be satisfied by the ordinary confines of life. The Brown's Chicken Massacre stands as a chilling reminder of how psychopathy, when coupled with a desire for control, can lead to the most heinous acts. Understanding the psychology of killers like Jackson is crucial not just for justice, but also for preventing future tragedies. As we continue to study the minds of criminals, we must confront the reality that sometimes the signs of a killer's mindset can be so subtle that they are easily missed until it is too late. In the next part, we will examine the trial and sentencing of James D. Jackson and the final moments of justice for the victims. What happened in the courtroom? What was his defense? How did the victims' families react to the conviction? Stay tuned as we close the chapter on the Brown's Chicken Massacre. But the story of justice doesn't end here. Part 4, the trial and conviction, seeking justice for the victims. After James D. Jackson's arrest, the focus shifted to the legal battle that would determine his fate and seek justice for the 7 victims of the Brown's Chicken Massacre. The trial became a focal point for the public, as it would not only determine the consequences for Jackson's horrific actions, but also bring closure to the families of the victims, the community, and the nation. The legal proceedings surrounding Jackson's trial were tense, emotional, and full of complex legal arguments. The legal proceedings, building the case against Jackson in the wake of Jackson's arrest. The prosecution team began preparing the case for trial. The prosecution's goal was clear: to bring Jackson to justice for the brutal killings at the Brown's Chicken restaurant and to ensure that he was held accountable for the immense pain he caused to the victims' families. The case was not just about seeking punishment for Jackson, but also about honoring the memory of the 7 innocent lives he had taken. From the very beginning, the circumstantial evidence against Jackson was overwhelming. The crime scene itself spoke volumes. Investigators found bloodstains and fingerprints linking Jackson to the scene, as well as surveillance footage that placed him near the restaurant on the night of the massacre. But beyond the physical evidence, the prosecution knew that they had a more significant challenge. They had to prove the intent behind the murders. Prosecutors painted a chilling picture of Jackson's mindset, portraying him as a cold-blooded killer who was motivated not just by greed or revenge, but by a desire for absolute power and control over his victims. The prosecution was determined to demonstrate that Jackson's actions were premeditated and that he had planned the killings with a disturbing level of detail. Witness testimony played a crucial role in building the prosecution's case. One of the key pieces of evidence presented in court was the testimony of surviving witnesses. While many of the victims were killed that night, there were a few survivors who had narrowly escaped Jackson's brutal rampage. These survivors were able to describe the harrowing moments leading up to the killings, providing first-hand accounts of Jackson's cold demeanor and the terror he instilled in the victims. Their testimonies painted a disturbing picture of Jackson's unflinching cruelty. Further strengthening the prosecution's case was the psychological profile of Jackson, which had been built based on his prior criminal history, his behavioral patterns, and his psychological state following the massacre. Expert testimony from forensic psychologists helped establish that Jackson was not only mentally competent to stand trial, but that he exhibited signs of psychopathy, a personality disorder that explained his lack of empathy and guilt for his actions. This expert testimony was crucial in illustrating that Jackson's motivations were not typical of a person who committed such a heinous crime out of momentary passion or rage. Jackson's defense, denial and manipulation as expected, Jackson's defense team fought tooth and nail to defend their client against the charges from the very outset. Jackson maintained his innocence. His defense attorneys argued that the evidence against him was circumstantial and that there was no direct proof of his involvement in the murders. They suggested that Jackson had been wrongfully accused and that the case against him had been built on a flawed investigation. Jackson's defense tried to present an alternative explanation for the evidence found at the crime scene, claiming that Jackson may have been in the restaurant but not responsible for the killings. They suggested that the actual killer was someone else entirely, casting doubt on the physical evidence that linked Jackson to the crime. However, the prosecution swiftly dismantled these claims, pointing out the inconsistencies in the defense's narrative. In addition to challenging the evidence, Jackson's defense team attempted to downplay his involvement by suggesting that he had acted in a state of temporary insanity. They argued that Jackson's history of mental health issues, coupled with his emotional turmoil, may have contributed to his violent actions. The defense team attempted to introduce psychological evaluations to show that Jackson was struggling with deep emotional disturbances, but this argument was met with resistance from the prosecution, which argued that Jackson's actions were the result of a calculated decision rather than a moment of temporary insanity. Despite the defense's best efforts to create doubt, the jury was not swayed by their arguments. Jackson's claim of innocence was undermined by the overwhelming evidence that suggested he had meticulously planned and executed the massacre. With chilling precision, the jury found Jackson's defense arguments lacking in credibility, and the mounting evidence of his involvement left little room for reasonable doubt. The emotional impact on the victim's Familia State trial was not just a legal battle, it was an emotional roller coaster for the families of the victims. For them, the trial was about more than just seeing Jackson convicted. It was about seeking closure and justice for the 7 lives that had been senselessly taken from them. The families of the victims attended every day of the trial, sitting through the harrowing testimonies, the graphic details of the crime, and the portrayal of their loved ones' final moments. For the families, the pain of reliving the trauma was immense. The emotional toll of hearing about their loved ones' deaths in such graphic detail was almost unbearable. However, many of the victims' family members also saw the trial as an opportunity to seek vindication for the lives lost. They were not just seeking revenge, they were fighting for justice for the memory of their loved ones and for the future, so that this kind of senseless violence would not happen again. In the courtroom, victim impact statements were read aloud, allowing family members to address the court and express their grief, anger, and sorrow over the murders. These statements were not only a cathartic release for the families, but also served as a powerful reminder to the jury of the real, human cost of Jackson's actions. The family's testimony reminded everyone that behind the legal proceedings were real people whose lives had been forever altered by the tragedy. For many of the families, the trial became an emotional reckoning. It was a painful but necessary process to face the reality of what had happened and to see Jackson held accountable for his actions. In their statements, the families expressed their desire for justice, their need to ensure that Jackson would never be able to harm anyone again. The verdict, justice delivered after weeks of intense testimony, deliberation, and emotional hearings. The jury finally reached a verdict on April 15, 1994. After a trial that captured the attention of the public and media alike, the jury delivered their decision, guilty on all counts. The verdict was met with a mixture of relief and sadness. The families of the victims, though relieved that justice had been served, understood that no amount of legal proceedings could bring their loved ones back. The trial may have been a step towards closure, but the pain of their loss would never fade. For Jackson, the verdict was a final recognition of the brutality of his crime. Despite his attempts to deny his involvement, the truth had come out, and he was now faced with the full weight of his actions. Sentencing and the road to closure. In May 10, 1994, James D. Jackson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was a tragic yet necessary conclusion to a case that had shaken the community of Palatine and the entire country. For the victims' families, the sentence was a moment of vindication, knowing that Jackson would never again have the opportunity to take another life. Jackson's sentencing also marked the end of a long and painful chapter for the families. While it did not undo the trauma they had endured, it did ensure that Jackson would no longer pose a threat to society. His life sentence was a grim reminder of the destructive nature of his actions and the power that one individual's bitterness and obsession with power could have over the lives of many others. The legacy of the Brown's Chicken Massacre, while now a matter of legal history, continues to impact the community and the families of the victims. The trial and its aftermath were a sobering reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of justice. The case also highlighted the need for greater attention to the psychological factors that contribute to criminal behavior, Understanding the mind of a killer, as we did with Jackson, is crucial not only for justice, but also for prevention. Jackson's actions were not those of a mind driven by a single moment of rage. They were the result of a complex web of psychological factors that developed over years. It is through understanding these factors that we can hope to prevent similar tragedies in the future. In the end, the Brown's Chicken Massacre is not just a case of murder, it is a case of the danger posed by unchecked rage, narcissism, and the craving for power. Jackson's story serves as a tragic cautionary tale of what happens when an individual feels entitled to control and domination at any cost. As we look back at this horrific event, we are reminded of the importance of justice, the power of the law to hold individuals accountable, and the need to support those left in the wake of such devastation. The victims of the massacre may have been taken too soon, but their memory lives on in the fight for justice and the determination of those who continue to seek answers in the face of unimaginable tragedy. And apart from Part 5, the aftermath, the impact of the case, and the legacy of the Brown's Chicken Massacre ripple effect, community trauma, and healing. Brown's Chicken Massacre left a scar that would never fully heal on the community of Palatine, Illinois. The violent and senseless killing shook not only the victims' families, but also the entire town, which had once felt like a close-knit community. In the weeks, months, and years that followed, residents were left grappling with the trauma of the killings. Many of them had frequented the Brown's Chicken restaurant, making the loss all the more personal. While the criminal justice system worked to hold Jackson accountable, the emotional and psychological impact of the crime lingered for the community. The massacre was a grief-stricken wake-up call for many, forcing them to face the harsh reality that violence could occur anywhere, even in places they thought were safe. The restaurant, once a familiar and comforting spot, was now associated with one of the most horrific tragedies in the state's history. The residents of Palatine, particularly those who lived near the Brown's Chicken location, were forced to wrestle with fear, confusion, and helplessness. How could such an atrocity happen in their own town? The questions hung in the air, unanswered. Many struggled to reconcile the peaceful image of Palatine with the horrific crimes that had occurred. For some, it meant an increased sense of vigilance, while for others, it meant never fully trusting the world around them again. The legal precedent set by the Cassidy trial of James D. Jackson was not only a significant moment for Palatine and the victims' families, but also for the legal community. The case set several important legal precedents. Most notably, it underscored the importance of forensic evidence in solving cold cases. The breakthrough with the chicken bones and Jackson's identification from the evidence became a landmark example of how even the smallest pieces of physical evidence could lead to solving a decades-old mystery. The case also demonstrated the power of the justice system to bring closure to the victims' families, showing that no matter how long it takes, justice can prevail. The tireless work of law enforcement and the legal teams involved reminded the public that, despite the difficulty and complexities of such a gruesome case, the system could still function to hold perpetrators accountable on a broader scale. The case had a lasting impact on law enforcement practices. In particular, it influenced how cold cases were handled across the country. Investigators began looking at older unsolved crimes through a new lens, one that prioritized even the smallest details and the potential connections to more modern technology. Jackson's eventual arrest due to seemingly insignificant pieces of evidence sent a message to the law enforcement community that no case is truly cold, and that justice for victims could always be within reach, no matter how long it took. The victims' families, healing and remembering the lost lives. While the trial may have brought a sense of legal justice, it did little to alleviate the emotional pain experienced by the victims' families. The loss of loved ones in such a brutal manner is something that stays with people forever. For the victims' families, the trial was only a part of their journey, a journey that would forever be marked by grief, loss, and the struggle to find peace. In the years that followed, the families of the victims found different ways to cope with their grief. Many chose to memorialize their loved ones through personal tributes, while others turned to support groups and counseling to help them navigate the emotional weight of their trauma. The public spotlight on the case, though a necessary part of the judicial process, also kept the memories of the victims alive in the media, giving the families little respite from the loss. However, some of the families turned their tragedy into something more powerful: advocacy. The horrific deaths at Brown's Chicken, the years of fighting for justice, and the emotional toll of the process all spurred them to speak out about crime prevention, victims' rights, and mental health awareness. Their voices carried a message to the wider public that violence, especially in such unexpected places, has long-lasting effects not just on the direct victims, but on entire communities. The families of the 7 victims, though forever changed, found strength in one another and in the memory of the loved ones they had lost. They fought to ensure that the deaths at Brown's Chicken were not in vain, working toward creating a legacy of remembrance for the victims and a continued push for justice. and reform. The national impact and reflection. While the Brown's Chicken massacre was a local tragedy, it had reverberations that extended well beyond Palatine. The case became a national conversation about the vulnerability of public spaces, the role of forensic evidence in criminal investigations, and the importance of perseverance in seeking justice. The media attention surrounding the case raised awareness about how systemic issues in law enforcement and the criminal justice system could affect both perpetrators and victims. It prompted discussions about how to better handle cold cases, how to strengthen forensic techniques, and how the system could be more responsive to the emotional needs of victims' families. Advocacy groups highlighted the importance of giving victims' families a voice in the process and ensuring they were supported throughout long and painful trials. The Brown's Chicken case served as a stark reminder that violence can happen anywhere, but so too can the persistence of justice. The public's response to the case showed an enduring desire for accountability. Even when years have passed since the crimes took place, it also led to greater scrutiny of the mental health systems in place for offenders and how the legal system can handle individuals with complex psychological profiles. Lessons learned and the ongoing fight for justice. The case against James D. Jackson has had lasting effects on both the legal system and the communities affected by violence. In the wake of his conviction and the years of pain that followed, there are several key lessons that can be drawn from the Brown's Chicken massacre. Never give up on cold cases. The success of this case was due in no small part to the investigators' refusal to let it go. Even though it took over 9 years for Jackson to be caught, the case was never dismissed. The message here is clear: justice can always be sought, and even the smallest detail can lead to breakthroughs. Forensic evidence is crucial. The use of forensic evidence, from DNA analysis to fingerprints and even the chicken bones left behind, shows how crucial science and technology are in solving modern crimes. The integration of more sophisticated tools and techniques into law enforcement could help resolve other cold cases in the future. Support for victims' families. The journey of the Brown's Chicken families highlights the importance of victim support systems. We must ensure that families are provided with proper emotional care, resources, and assistance, not just during the trial, but long after it has ended. Raising awareness of mental health. Jackson's psychological profile prompted greater attention to the role that mental health plays in violent crime. It raises questions about the systems in place for identifying and addressing potential threats before they escalate into tragedy. Call to action CTA. As we wrap up the story of the Brown's Chicken massacre, the key takeaway is that justice prevailed in the end, but the impact of this tragedy will never truly be erased. The victims may no longer be with us, but their stories continue to shape the conversation about justice, crime, and the importance of perseverance. If you've been touched by this story or the lessons it teaches us about crime, justice, and the families who bear the burden of loss, we encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What can we do as a society to prevent such crimes from happening again? How can we support those who have suffered from the pain of violent crime? Like, subscribe, and share this video to keep the conversation going. By staying informed and engaged, we can work together to create a safer, more just society. Thank you for joining us for this journey through one of the most haunting cases in modern history. Stay tuned for more stories from Room 57 that dive deep into the darker corners of crime, justice, and the human spirit. We'll see you next time.